Okay, so we are here to talk about orchids this evening. There are a lot of interesting things you will hear about orchids depending on who you talk to. It's going to range from they are extremely finicky plants to they are the easiest things ever to grow. And there's a lot to separate there to actually find the valuable information amongst all the urban legends and myths surrounding the difficulty or the ease with which you can develop orchids. So let's just dive right in a little bit here. So tonight I want to go over the types of orchids and the environments that you're going to find them in. And there's actually a lot of information to parse right there because it not only goes from what section of the world do they come from, but literally what kind of environment are they growing on? Because a lot of orchids don't do traditional grow in the soil like you would with other garden plants. We're going to talk a little bit about some best management practices. Like I said, orchids aren't necessarily the most finicky plants in the world, but you do want to pay attention. There are a few different things depending on the species you grow. And then to top off this evening, I'm going to talk about choosing the right orchid for you. I'm going to be focusing on the 4 most popular orchid species that people typically are going to consider putting in their homes or in their gardens. While there are a lot of orchid species and hybrids that we could talk about, I didn't want to keep you guys here for a 6-hour program. So let's just get started with some orchid types. This was perhaps one of the most unique things. I got to learn quite a bit while I was putting this together. There are 4 primary types of orchids, and this is going to touch on that. What kind of environment do they grow in? So we're going to start with our epiphytes. This type of orchid represents about 70% of most of the homegrown orchids you're going to encounter. So these are fairly common to find throughout stores, throughout homes, but you're not going to be seeing them grown directly in a garden. Now the name epiphyte means that this is a plant that grows on the surface of another plant. Most commonly, you're going to see them developing on the surface of a tree. We're going to go a little further into that when we get to the specific species that people like to grow for these. Now what this means is that this orchid has an exposed root system, so it's drawing its moisture directly from the air and if any kind of surface it's sticking to. So you can probably guess that an epiphytic orchid is probably in a very humid place, and that kind of matches where they grow. And here's an example of one epiphytic orchid right here growing on the surface of this tree. Well, the tree looks like it almost looks dead, but there's actually a lot of life there, and this orchid is taking complete advantage of that. And I want to add to this, I can't take credit for the images. I tried to make sure to credit the photo takers where I could, but there are a lot of pictures of orchids, and not everybody labeled them, unfortunately. So our next orchid type that we're going to talk a little bit about are lithophytes. Now these are very similar to a lot of our carnivorous plants. So when I used to do work in Mississippi, I used to do work in a wet pine savanna. And in this savanna, you would find a lot of pitcher plants because it abutted some wetlands and it created this perfect environment where there was just enough stone coming through the soil surface, and these plants could grow on those stones and find nutrition. Well, these orchid types are very similar to these pitcher plants. They will grow on rocks. They're going to draw their moisture from that area. They're going to consume dead plant tissue that's come up around these rocks, and they will even consume their own dead plant tissue. So they're very, very efficient plants. One of the biggest homegrown varieties that you'll find, and we're going to talk about this one quite a bit later, is the Paphiopedilum orchid variety. And it's a popular one and a fairly easy one to grow in your home. And here's a great example of some pitcher plants that came from Mississippi State University, and an image of a lithophytic orchid to go along with it. Now our third orchid type is the kind known as a saprophyte. Now this is a type of plant that will consume dead plant material. So it does not have chlorophyll and it does not perform photosynthesis. These often grow completely underground. Some plants do have above ground sections, and those sections, when they're seen, are typically noted for yellowish leaves and small flowers. And the reason for that coloring is that since these plants don't have chlorophyll, that telltale green color just isn't going to be there. Now, you probably won't see very many saprophytic orchids, but there is one that is reasonably well known over in Europe. This one is known as the bird nest orchid. A few people may attempt to grow these as hobbyist orchid growers because there are a lot of folks who get really deeply into these and they really want to test their ability to develop these plants. But if you are just getting into orchid development or you're interested in it, this is not going to be your beginner plant. This is not one that you are just going to grab and say, hey, I'm going to try this in my home. Okay, so for our last type of orchid to go over this evening, are terrestrial orchids. These are our traditionally soil-grown orchids. Now, this only represents about 1% of all orchid species. But that being said, we have a lot of native orchid species that grow in the ground within the continental United States. Like it says there, they're going to grow in a traditional soil or sandy environment. And these species are often ones that are much hardier than the average orchid. So if they're able to grow in the temperate zone, they're significantly hardier than most of the tropical species that people are going to focus on. And these are the kinds of orchids that you will be able to plant in your garden and expect them to be successful. They may not match up perfectly with how you envision growing flowers, but they're not that much harder, really. And this is just a great example of one of those native orchid species right here. This is one that's more native to the more tropical areas of the United States, because as you can see by the photo credit there, it's taken by the University of Florida in Escambia County. All right, so let's talk a little bit about those environments. I told you a little bit about them. So if we're talking about our epiphytes, and if you remember, these are orchids that grow on the surface of other plants. These are going to typically be in tropical areas attached to tree surfaces. And that matches because we find these mostly in Central America, from Mexico through Brazil, growing on the woody surfaces of trees where you're going to see that good development of moss and other things there that they can take advantage of to gain nutrition. Lithophytes, however, are much more cosmopolitan. They can grow on lots of different kinds of rock surfaces. They can be found on the sides of mountains or cliffs. There are lots of unique sprays of orchids that you can find coming off of rock faces. And like I said, I put wet pine savannas in there as a potential environment you could also find them in as well. Now for our saprophytes, these are going to be focused in areas with very high plant detritus. So you're looking at places like a very thick forest floor, probably relatively undisturbed. So I would be surprised if you would find them in a place such as like California, which gets regular fires, but maybe you could find them more in like old forests, like the ones that are commonly found in Europe where that bird nest orchid can be found. Now our terrestrial orchids, these are the ones that we really like because they're able to grow here in the United States and do. These guys can actually survive in hardiness zones 5 through 9, and some of them are even year-round plants. You don't need to move them inside. They are meant to be outside, and they will survive in that environment. You're not going to get them blooming in the winter, but they'll be able to come back. All right, so some best management practices. Now, this is the one where I expect questions to be generated because, like I said, there are a lot of urban legends and myths on how to handle orchids. So I'm going to try to give you the best information I can, but I also want to preface this with the fact that this is going to be very dependent on what type of orchid you're growing. So you're going to have to bear with me on part of this. So there are some questions you need to ask yourself when you're considering this. The first and perhaps most important one is what kind of light and temperature are you working with? Now, I'm framing this in the sense that you're probably planning on bringing these orchids inside your home, or you're planning on just growing them solely inside your home. If you are moving them outside, then a lot of this will just simply come down to, does it have enough air movement and does it have enough water? But if it's inside your house, you really need to focus on light, temperature, humidity, and a few other factors. And of course, the second question would be, what species do you want to grow? This is what everything is dependent on. Some species are going to be significantly easier to grow. Others are going to be much more challenging. And of course, the last one, what growth type is it? Is it an epiphyte? Is it terrestrial? The reason I put this in here is I don't expect you to grow an orchid on another plant within your home. However, the potting media that you're using is going to change based on the needs of that orchid. If you're growing a Cattleya versus a few other ones, you may find that it's going to need a different kind of potting media. So let's start with some light requirements, perhaps the most important one. So orchid specialists use a few different definitions to explain the light requirements for orchids. So they like to define the amount of light something gets in foot candles. So if you want some comparison, like it says here, a bright sunny day is going to represent about 10,000 foot candles. However, inside your home, where it's nice and shady, it's probably only going to be about 100 foot candles. Now, for the most part, orchids have fairly high light requirements for plants. Now, if it's an orchid that needs a lot of light, it's a very sun-loving plant, you're looking at about 3,000 foot candles needed there. If it's only maybe a partial shade or maybe doesn't need as much light, you're looking at 2 to 3,000. And of course, a more shade-loving orchid, it's really only going for about 1.2 to 2K foot candles. So what's this mean? It's going to need to be in certain places. It means that when you place an orchid in your home, you are going to have to place it right in a window. You are not going to be sitting it on a table near a window. It's going to be right there. And you have several choices that are going to be primed towards getting the best light for this orchid. Now, inside your house, your first choice is going to be a south-facing window. That, for most orchid species, not all, but most, a south-facing window is going to provide the most light over the course of a normal day. Your second choice is going to be the east-facing window. Your third one is going to be a west-facing window. And part of that has to do with sunlight isn't a perfect line right across the sky directly above us. The movement of our planet throughout the year is going to influence it, whereas where the south-facing window is probably going to get the most light. Now, your last resort, the place that you probably don't want to put the orchid at all, is going to be your north-facing window. It's going to get the least amount of light. Now, that being said, there are some orchid species where it is going to be better to place them in the north-facing window because some species are going to be more sensitive and they will get sunburned much, much easier. And of course, one of the benefits of placing orchids near your windows too is going to be air circulation. It is critical that you keep air moving around your orchids. This will keep them healthier, and it's going to keep pest and pathogen populations down around your orchid. All right, a little bit on temperature here. So temperature requirements for orchids generally are going to be much higher than average for a lot of plants. Temperature is going to be very, very central to making them bloom and keeping blooms for longer. However, if you use a constant temperature, you are hamstringing your orchid. Orchids are plants that are meant to experience a day-night cycle, and this is reflected in the quality of their blooming. If they have a constant temperature at all times, you're going to find that blooms just don't happen as much. Sometimes they may not happen at all. You need that day-night fluctuation, sometimes between 10 and 15 degree difference between daytime and nighttime. So they've got 4 categories of temperature tolerance for orchids. And this is actually something that's very important to pay attention to. This is one of those things that's going to make and break your orchid if you're inside a home. If it's a warm growing plant, those nighttime temperatures need to stay at or above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this is only going to be for your most tropical orchids. The more intermediate growing ones, they're going to require between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're looking at more subtropical into getting closer to that temperate zone growing orchid. Your cool growing orchids, of course, will need 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the hardy ones, the ones that are going to be in that hardiness zone 5 through 9, those can be grown outdoors year round. They don't care. They can survive the temperatures that we reach. Of course, here in Indiana, you do need to keep in mind our ground will freeze very readily, so you're going to want to think about that if you decide that you want to grow some of the more terrestrial orchids outside. Now, like I said before, that drop of 10 degrees is critical for flowering. If you don't allow the temperature drops to occur, you're going to start getting issues where the orchid may become stunted, where it may not bloom, It's just not going to respond correctly. It's like waking a bear up out of its winter nap. That bear won't survive, neither will your orchid. You may want to make sure that you place these orchids at or near windows or turn off grow lamps at the appropriate time. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking about using grow lamps to develop your orchids. When I talk about some individual species, I'm going to talk a little bit more about using grow lamps and how best to use them. But the key thing I want you to take away from here is make that temperature change happen. Don't let them sit in a constant temperature. All right, watering requirements. This is one that I'm going to repeat myself a lot on, and I'm going to repeat that first statement right there. Overwatering is the #1 cause of death in houseplants. Let's say it again for everyone in the back. Overwatering is the #1 cause of death in houseplants. Your watering must correspond to the needs of the plant, and not all plants are made equal. This is especially true for orchids. If you overwater an orchid, it will die. Or worse, it'll have a healthy plant, but it will never bloom. And you'll be very, very frustrated. Trust me on this. Now, the great thing about orchids, like I've said before, they are not as finicky. You can let orchids dry out. Generally, they will do much better if you let the soil dry out, and then you go ahead and you drench them once the soil has dried. There are a few different things you can do to check how well the soil has dried out before you choose to water again. One of them is to just push your finger in about an inch down into the soil. If the soil is moist at your finger, then don't water the plant. If it's gotten dry that far down, then yeah, you need to go ahead and water it. Check the weight of your pots. If you can pick up 2 pots, one wet and one dry, and you can notice a real weight difference, you might want to consider doing some watering. Now, when you water an orchid, it is a drench plant, so you're going to water it until water starts coming out of the bottom, but you're not going to let water sit. You want to make sure that orchids have very good drainage, because if you let the water sit in there, then you're going to start encountering a lot of fungal diseases and a lot of other issues that can get started. So make sure that that orchid has very good drainage, but just keep in mind, it's a drenching plant. It is not one that you just keep watered all the time. Now, one recommendation I've seen from Tennessee Extension is to shower the plants only twice yearly to reduce the dust and debris on the plant. And that is generally, I think, a very good idea, because that dust and debris is going to give harborage to insects and potentially an opening for pathogens to be able to begin affecting your plant. When you do water or shower this plant, only use warmer water. Cool water will damage the root systems of orchids. Remember, these are primarily tropical plants, and if you use colder water on them, you're doing what's called cold stress or cold shock. Stress will make your plant become unhealthy. A cold shock can outright kill a plant or plant parts. So it's very important that you use warmer water. The other thing considering watering requirements, though not quite watering requirements, is the humidity level in the area. Most orchids are going to need a much higher humidity than what is probably in the surrounding area of your home, or depending on where you are, the surrounding area of your garden. So if you're out in the middle of one of my counties, say you're out in the middle of Clay County and you have a garden, some of those areas are a little bit hilly and they get a lot of sun. And if you're planning on growing orchids outside, you need to make sure that you've accounted for that humidity loss in the sunlight. If you're in the home, you need to start thinking about using a humidifier or using a gravel tray to hold some water, and that way you can increase the humidity in the area. There are also lots of tools that you can get from gardening stores to help you monitor that humidity directly. So you've got a lot of options there to help you out. Okay, another big one, fertilizer requirements. There are a few unique fertilizer requirements when it comes to orchids. So like I've said before, the fertilizer is going to be highly dependent on the type of orchid you're growing and the growing media that it's sitting in. You only want to apply fertilizer to an orchid once a week and only when the plant is growing. Now, as the plant begins to leave its growth cycle and the growth begins to taper off, you're going to want to taper off the fertilizer application along with it. And when the plant has gone dormant in the colder season, you don't need to be fertilizing at all. All you're going to do there is if you add fertilizer, you're going to end up burning your plant. So make sure that when it gets to this time of year, you have long been done with the fertilizer application. Now, one of the things that you can consider is that there are actually a lot of pre-formulated fertilizer for orchids. Very, very specific and often very specific to the type of orchid that you're developing. Yeah, if you're thinking about using fertilizer with an orchid, I would strongly recommend making that consideration. But if you want to go ahead and forego that and just use an equally balanced fertilizer, like if you got some 10-10-10 or 12-12-12, dilute it to about a quarter of its strength with water to avoid burning the plant. And that's very important. If you're going to use a fertilizer that isn't specifically formulated, you need to make sure you dilute it because orchid uptake is going to be much different than other plants. Remember, these guys grow either on other plants or on rocks where they're getting nutrient from the surrounding materials around them. So their nutrient uptake is going to function wholly different than a lot of the plants you may already have inside your home, like your basil or other things. So keep this in mind. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some orchids to consider. If you're thinking about growing orchids inside your home or in your garden, I'm going to go over 4 different orchid species that are going to be probably the best ones to choose from. They're going to be primarily geared towards beginners, but if you're a confident orchid grower, there are also plenty of other orchid varieties to choose from. And if you guys have questions about some more difficult to grow orchids, feel free to message me about them after our program. So one thing to think about when you want to grow orchids, if you are just getting started, don't start with the showiest orchid. Usually those are the hardest to work with. And I find that to be true of a lot of plants. The plants that make the biggest surprise, the biggest colors, they're usually the biggest pain too. So choose a species that's going to be based on your experience level. Don't go for the showiest. Go for one that's going to be reliable. Go for one that's going to work within your home and your schedule. If you are just starting and you need a plant that you can ignore for a week and a half, then there may be an orchid for you. Now these 4 specimens are going to be based on the ease of experience and scheduling, like I said. So let's dive into them a little bit. So first, the Cattleya orchid, or cats, known also as the Corsage orchid. Now this is probably the most commonly grown orchid in the home. And these things are great. They come in lots of different colors, and they are very, very fragrant. This is also an epiphytic orchid or epiphytic orchid. They are tropical to Central and South America, and you can find them growing on the surfaces of trees throughout those areas. I also wanted to point something out before we move to our next slide because I am an entomologist and this always fascinates me. If you look at the flower right here, orchids are very, very well developed towards encouraging insects to visit them. And you can even see this in this image of this cat orchid right here. You can see it's got a nice landing pad that a bee or something could land on. And then it's got a very straight shot cave kind of thing right there where the insect can crawl right in, get covered in pollen that's hidden up in there to be able to get to the nectar well. So I think that that's just an interesting thing. And I'm going to point out a few other orchids that actually kind of mimic insects in a lot of different ways. Okay, so back to our Cattleya orchids. So if you are growing these are more sun-loving plants, but they are not fully sun-loving. So you want to use the east or west facing windows. You want to get a little bit of partial shade if you're going to use that south facing window. Now, if you are going to use grow lamps to assist you when growing these orchids, the current recommendation is to use 4 40-watt bulbs with 2 incandescent bulbs about 8 inches above the surface of the plant. Now, I'm naming that specifically because some orchids need different height requirements for the light, because that way you can get enough light to the orchid but avoid sunburning it with artificial lights. Now, this goes for all orchids, is that you want to check for dark green foliage or for poor blooming to determine if your light quality is good enough. If orchids are a deep green, that means that it's actually not healthy. Whereas a lot of plants, if it's a nice dark green, we go, hey, that's great. That's exactly what I want. This is not true for orchids. The leaves should have some yellow to them. That's how you know it's getting enough light. Use that to determine if you pick the right spot, if you are providing enough light. Now, Cattleyas also require about a 15 to 20 degree nighttime temperature change. So that's a pretty big change right there. And you're going to want to make sure to facilitate that. Daytime temperatures are going to be optimal between 70 and 85 degrees. So if you're growing them in your home, our homes generally don't go too much above 70 degrees normally. So you're going to want to take that into consideration. The good thing is if you're putting it in the light of one of your windows, you're going to get some increase in temperature. So I highly recommend you get either a laser thermometer or something to help you figure out what the temperature is on a surface where the light is coming in through a window. And that way you can make sure you monitor that and you'll know how much heat the orchid is getting. Then the nighttime temperature is going to be around 55 to 65 than optimal. So if I were doing this in my home, what I would do is I have a south-facing window in my kitchen where it's going to get nice and warm during the day because it's got a big picture window right there. But at nighttime, you can feel the cold leaching in through there. And while I despair of my heating bills, that also creates a great environment for orchid development because there's that big temperature difference that I can feel right there. Now, Cattleyas are interesting because they use a pseudobulb, which is a water storing organ. Now, this makes sense. This plant is growing on the surface of trees. It doesn't have a root system based in wet soil. So it's going to store up water for those times when it gets extremely dry in the higher heat of the areas where it grows natively. So this means, though, that if you're growing orchids in your home, a Cattleya at least, you need to take that pseudobulb into account. You got to make sure the soil or potting media that you're using dries out before you water again, or else you're going to overwater that plant. The optimal humidity for our cats are going to be around 50 or 60%. So what I recommend doing is using the simple gravel tray method of providing enough humidity. All you're going to do is you're going to be setting the plant right on top of the gravel within a tray, and you're going to get that gravel soaked in some water. You don't want the water to come into contact with the bottom of the pot. You want the pot to sit on top of that gravel. The purpose of this is that water is going to volatilize in the air. It's going to vaporize and release the humidity and surround that orchid and provide that right environment for it. And as I mentioned earlier, and this is going to be true for all of our orchids that we discussed tonight, good aeration and drainage is going to be critical. Keep that air moving, which if you're by a window that's getting plenty of sun and temperature difference, that air is going to move because of the shift in temperatures. But focus on that drainage. Make sure you don't let anything sit in water. Now, when it comes to fertilizer, the best recommendation I can give for growing a cat orchid is use a formulated fertilizer. Save yourself the headache. However, I'm willing to bet some of those formulated fertilizers are probably a little bit expensive. So if you're going to switch to using a balanced one, use a dilution where you've diluted it down to 1/4 or 1/2 before you apply it. What I would do here is start with the 1/4. That way you can tell, am I burning the plant? Is it getting enough? That way you don't just automatically burn the plant and do something that's not going to be recoverable. Start with that 1/4 and then work your way up if you feel like that's insufficient. And of course, when you're using the fertilizer, make sure you fertilize it weekly when it's growing, only when it's growing. All right, our next orchid, the Phalaenopsis. These are our moth orchids. And I think these are really, really aptly named because, like I was mentioning with the Cattleya orchids, take a look at that picture. You can kind of see the moth shape in the picture. And this is intentional because they want these insects to come and pollinate. So if it looks like another insect, some of these orchids will actually put out a chemical signal, a pheromone, that mimics the mating signal of some of the species that it wants to pollinate. So a female or a male will come up to it thinking they're going to find a mate and get covered in pollen, and hey, they get a food source out of it too. So moth orchids are also really popular and easy to grow for beginners. These are mostly native to the Philippines, and there are a couple of different orchid types that are going to be coming from the Philippines. Now these are really long blooming, and they're also great as cut flowers. So if you want to cut these and put them in water, they will be able to last for up to a week. So that's a pretty good deal you're getting there out of our Phalaenopsis. Now these are low light plants, so you're going to want to place them in an east facing window to avoid some sunburn. If you feel like your east facing window may get too much light, then you may want to shift over to your west facing window. If the light you feel like is inadequate, you can go ahead and place it under some artificial light for about 14 hours a day. But you're going to want to make sure you monitor what height that light is at. Keep it at that 8 inches and don't let the plant grow further closer to it or else it's going to get sunburned. And of course, like I mentioned with the Cattleyas, check that leaf color, check that bloom quality. If the plant is getting greener and greener, that means that you are not getting enough light. You want that tissue to have at least a little bit of yellow to it. Much like our cat orchids, this one's going to need about 70 to 85 degree daytime temperatures, but you don't want to go lower than 60 degree at nighttime or else you're going to start putting it into cold stress. However, it is going to need a higher humidity. Where was I? We're talking about humidity. So we are looking at about 60 to 70% humidity that you're going to need here. So it is going to be critical that you use something to supplement the humidity for this orchid. You want to use that gravel tray or a humidifier. Just monitor the plant closely when you increase the humidity around it. Don't increase it so much that you start to get condensation on the surface of the plant, because if you get that, that means that you're going to have some problems with diseases, and that's something you really want to avoid. Now, this one is going to prefer an evenly moist soil. This is the one that's going to be different than all the other orchids. Our moth orchids, they actually like the soil to stay moist. They're going to be pretty sensitive to drying. So if you recall the Philippines, like I said probably before, they're very humid by nature, and this orchid is going to need that similar environment. So a little bit on our potting mix for our Phalaenopsis. I felt like this was going to be necessary to focus in a little bit more on because there are some unique recommendations for this one. You're going to be looking at a 60% medium fir bark with 20% perlite and chopped sphagnum for the recommendation for this mix. Our Phalaenopsis, if I remember correctly, is one of our Lithophytes. So that's why you're looking at a higher stone content in there. You're also going to be, if you choose to fertilize it with a balanced fertilizer, you want to dilute it to 1/4 weekly during growth. So don't go past that 1/4. This is going to be a more sensitive plant. All right, this is always an orchid that kind of fascinates me. And again, you can kind of see that insect shape in there too. These are our Paphiopedilums, our slipper orchids. And I always find these very, very fascinating. There actually is a carnivorous orchid that is within this group, I believe, and it kind of has this shape. And you can almost see it in this one here where there's a kind of well that could potentially trap an insect. So this is also another great beginner flower. It offers this multicolored appearance, and the mottling is just all over the petals and the leaves. Sometimes it can be so mottled that I've heard some people be concerned that the plant is diseased when it's actually not. It's just that's how it looks. This one originates from a lot of Asian area. You can find it from northern India to southern China. And again, you can also find this one in the Philippines. So these are another set of low light plants that you're going to want to treat the same as our moth orchids for natural and artificial lighting. Now, there is going to be a little bit of difference in temperature requirements because you can find mottled leaf types and you can find plain leaf types. So for our mottled leaf types, you're looking at a preferred 80-degree daytime temperature with a 60-degree nighttime. So if you're growing these in your home, you're probably already using a setup where you've got like a greenhouse or a hothouse or something similar where you could take advantage of that. If you're looking at plain leaf varieties, you're looking at a 75 to 85 degree daytime temperature with a nighttime temperature that won't dip below 50 degrees. When you get into the cooler season, both of these types, you're looking at 55 to 60 degree nighttime temperatures at the lowest. Now, if you're growing in home, you're looking at 60 to 70 degree humidity, so use that gravel tray. You're going to water it thoroughly, but you never want it to allow it to fully dry out. It can get drier than our moth orchids, but you don't want it to get fully dried out or else the orchid's going to go into stress. So keep that in mind if you choose to work with the Paphiopedilum. Now for its recommended potting mix, we're looking at something that's so slightly different than the previous orchid. You're looking at about 50% medium to fine fir bark mixed with 1/4 coarse quartz sand and 1/4 quartz perlite or milled leaf mold or even chopped sphagnum moss. And again, if you're using a balanced fertilizer, use these at 1/4 strength, dilute it down, use it weekly, and of course only when it's growing. Now for the final orchid that we're going to talk about this evening, and the final bit of our evening here that we're going to talk about, we're going to look at our Oncidiums, our dancing lady orchids. These are actually my favorite ones. I love how these look. They have these great little sprays and small flowers that you can find, and I just think they're awesome. So this is going to be the flower that is not really intended for beginners. This one's going to be more difficult to grow than all of our other orchids. The good news is, however, that there are some hybrids of our dancing ladies that are going to be a little bit easier to manage for beginners. But primarily they are tropical natives that tend to be a little bit more difficult. So if you choose to grow a dancing lady, do some research on individual species so that way you can avoid the pitfalls. Now these have a very high light requirement as compared to our other orchids. 2,500 foot candles is the recommendation. So if you guys remember earlier, when I gave you that comparison of foot candles, the highest upper limit for an orchid was about 3,000 foot candles, and this one's at 2,500. So it's going to need a lot of light. It's going to have some thicker leaves on it, so they can probably tolerate more light on average. But if you have an Oncidiums that has a little bit thinner leaf, try to keep that in mind to avoid sunburning. If you have it in your home, you're going to be using a high sun south facing window, so a good window like that picture window I was just talking about where it's getting a ton of sunlight. And if you're supplementing with artificial light, you're going to move it down. You're actually going to put it about 6 inches above the plant, depending on the plant height and how bushy it is. So for this one, our daytime temperatures are going to be optimal in the 80s with a nighttime no lower than 55. So again, monitor that temperature where it's going to be sitting. However, it does have lower humidity requirements. It only needs about 30 to 60% humidity. So unless you have a particularly dry home, and I know during the winter that could be an issue, but unless you have a dry home, you probably don't need to supplement the humidity for this plant, which is kind of nice in that regard. You're going to allow this plant to dry between watering. Those thicker leaves are going to last longer. So that's where it's going to start to get really challenging, is how much you're going to water this, because those thicker leaves are going to cause some problems with how often you want to water. So you're going to be monitoring more closely. You're going to be babying it a little more. So the recommended potting mix for this one is going to be slabs of cork bark or tree fern, coarse materials like charcoal. So we're probably looking at an epiphytic plant here that grows on the surface of other plants. For fertilizer and a bark-based media, you're going to be using 1/4 of 30-10-10 twice a month. So keep that in mind. If you choose to grow an Oncidiums, you're looking at different fertilizer requirements here. That's a much higher nitrogen level. In other media, other than our bark-based, you're looking at a 20-20-20. And you're doing that at the same rate. All right, so one thing that I just wanted to add to this is you'll note that tonight I actually didn't talk about insects or diseases. Well, there's actually a reason for this. One of the great things about orchids is they're fairly resistant to insects and diseases, which is something that I got to learn myself while putting all this together. They can get traditional in-home insects, whiteflies, mealybugs, that kind of thing, but we've gone over a lot of how to get rid of those. You're looking at keeping the plants clean, using a horticultural oil, or even just some soapy water or cotton ball with alcohol on it to get rid of insects. Fungal diseases generally aren't a major issue among orchids. So in that regard, these plants can often be easier than the other homegrown plants that you may be developing right now. Now there is a whole lot more information that I could have put into this because there are a lot of orchids and a lot of unique things about orchids to consider when growing them. So you guys can always feel free to message me if you have additional questions. But with that, if you have any questions right now, I am more than happy to answer them.